next session, we have Professor Swati Roy Chowdhury with us. May I request Professor Roy Chowdhury to please come on stage. This session addresses scars. Scars are but evidence of life. In this particular session, we are going to discuss Professor Angshuman Kar's first collection of poems, translated poems, Wound is the Shelter. And to discuss his work, we have Professors Sayantan Dasgupta. So I request both of them, Professor Dasgupta and Professor Kar, to please come on stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to all of you to this session. Today, there is going to be a discussion on Angshuman Kar's anthology, Wound is the Shelter, which, as according to this book, is a collection of poems translated from the original Bengali by the poet. And to discuss this, we have the poet himself with us and Professor Sayantan Dasgupta, Associate Professor and Head, Department of Comparative Literature, Jadavpur. So, since Sir said that we are really running short of time, I'll not be extending my my introductory speech too much, and I directly request Professor Dasgupta to please come and say a few words about this anthology, after which we will be beginning our discussion.
Good afternoon. I'm very grateful to have been asked to speak at this session. English Bangla miliye bolbe? Okay. First of all, I think this is a curious book that we have. I say curious because this is a book where the translator has become invisible, in the sense that the translator and the poet are both the same person. And this is a curious thing because, as we all know, there is this long-standing debate about the translator and the poet and their relationship. Lakshmi Holmstrom, যিনি অনুবাদ নিয়ে অনেক কথা বলেছেন, তিনি একটা প্রবন্ধে লিখেছিলেন যে লেখকের সঙ্গে অনুবাদকের সম্পর্কটা কি রকম হবে, এবং একটা জিনিস সম্পর্কে তিনি খুব সতর্ক করে দিয়েছিলেন আমাদের, সেটা হচ্ছে যে অনুবাদক খুব বেশি লেখকের কাছে গিয়ে প্রশ্ন করা, জিজ্ঞেস করা, তার উপদেশ নেওয়া, এটার ব্যাপারে উনি একটু skeptical, because the writer, the poet often exercises some kind of a proprietorship over the text. So there's this question of who owns the translation apart from who owns the original text. We have also seen what happens when we have self-translation. The classic example would be that of Kurutulen Haidar. Kurutulen Haidar লিখেছিলেন উর্দুতে তার যে মাস্টারপিস উপন্যাস আগ কা দরিয়া, and it was a runaway success. It was a monumental work encompassing a large swathe of Indian history, and the publishers wanted it translated from Urdu into other languages. So they approached Kurutulen Appa and asked her to give permission for the book to be translated into English. Kurutulen Haidar said, okay, who will do the translation? Asked the publisher. Kurutulen Haidar said, I'll do the translation. You'll do the translation? Yes, I'm the writer, I know the Urdu, I know the English, I'll translate myself. And so she translated Aag Ka Darya as a river of fire. Aag Ka Darya, river of fire, theek hi to hai. Now when the book went to press, the writer being the translator, what did we see? We see that the text underwent many changes. One chapter became 4.5 chapters in the translation. 3 chapters became half a chapter in the translation. Names, titles of chapters changed radically. The whole temper of the book changed. Whether or not that's a legitimate move, it's not for me to speak about. The writer might say, it's my baby, it's my book, so I know what I can do about it. How far this has happened or not happened with this book is again not something I am equipped to say. But what I can say is that this book of poems comes across wonderfully as poetry. I think in translation, out of translation, the success of poetry must be measured by how the reader responds to it. এবং পোয়েট্রি হিসেবে কিন্তু এটা আমার মনে হয় একটা খুবই এফেক্টিভ, একটা খুবই পাওয়ারফুল বডি অফ লিটারেচার হয়ে উঠেছে। হোয়াট ইজ অংশুমান করস পোয়েট্রি অ্যাবাউট? আমার পড়ে যেটা মনে হলো, one of the major concerns that Angshuman deals with in his poetry is the idea of poetry itself. That's one of the abiding concerns. And I think one answer to this question comes out in this wonderful short poem that he has in this book, where he writes, "A poet is like a pencil. A poet is like a pencil. The more you cut, the sharper it becomes." Okay. In other words, poetry comes from suffering, poetry comes from experience, poetry comes from subjective oneself to taking note of what is around us. The more one sees and thinks about the world, the more powerful the poet's poetry becomes. And the poems in this volume, I thought, were intensely contemporary. They were responding to contemporary situations. But at the same time, they speak of universal values and civilizational imperatives. What is it like to be human? That is a question that comes back again and again, if not overtly, then in some covert, recondite way in so many of his poems. Some of the poems are unembarrassedly political in the broadest sense of the word. On many occasions we see the poet's role being probed. What does it mean to be a poet in today's world? And again, a beautiful poem that stuck to me was this one, where he talks about the poet being a small river. A small river is beneficent, is generous. It allows many people to cross over to do many things. But the same small river can also roar in protest. The poet is like that. Given the situation, given the social realities, the poet responds in many different ways. Protest and love, these are two themes that seem to merge into one another in Angshuman's poetry. Every poem of resistance turns into a love poem in a way, because it is always perhaps out of love in some form or the other that protest emerges. He's got a whole poem dedicated precisely to this theme. Another very brave poem that I thought he has written is this one, which takes on the question of political correctness, where he writes, what can the poet write about? If I'm not a woman, can I write about injustice against women? Can I not? If I'm not a Dalit, do I not have the right to speak out against atrocities against the Dalit, and so on and so forth? So the rhetorical questions all lead you to the direction that as a human being, as a poet with a social responsibility, surely anything that I see which strikes me as odd, unusual, injustice is something that I can and I need to write about. Social justice is one of the abiding concerns of Angshuman's poetry, so aptly summed up in this poem, where the poet narrator challenges many things, many developments in the world today, but says one thing I'm not against is the building of flyovers. Why is it that I'm not against the building of flyovers? Because the building of flyovers provides a roof to the roofless. It provides shelter to the homeless. So that's the kind of social responsibility that comes out in these poems. Again, I think this is a remarkable body of poetry, because these poems are poems that masquerade as short stories. Many of the poems are almost aphoristic towards the end, almost like that turn in the Mapasa story, where the last few lines give the story a new meaning. That's what happens in many of the poems here as well. For instance, this poem about toys, it goes on to talk about toys and children playing with toys and so on and so forth. Seems to be a very pedestrian poem at one level until one reaches the last couple of lines. Children take toys as humans, and adults consider humans as toys. Those are brilliant interjections at the end which give the poetry an added dimension of its own. Nature is another very important thematic element for Angshuman's poetry, I thought. This is my personal reading. I don't know how far the poet translator will agree with me. But the symbiosis between the natural world and the human world is again something that keeps coming back. But what is so impressive about his poetry is not just the themes, of course. Themes are only one part of poetry. The striking imagery, similes, metaphors, expressions that keep coming back in the poetry. Come to me the way a song comes to a blind beggar. The spontaneity that is associated with this kind of an expression. Or this poem where he talks about, I am that page of a book you were reading before you went off to sleep. Now you are asleep and I am lying down on your bosom. What could be more intimate than that? What could be more tactile than that? I think those are some of the things that struck me while I was reading the poems. I should stop here. I shouldn't eat up more of the time, and maybe the moderator will take over. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much, sir, for this speech full of erudition. But as you were speaking about the different themes of these poems, I found that you might have missed on the issue of memory, how memories have been dealt with in his poems. So I would like to ask Professor Kaur to elaborate on this theme. I mean, how have you seen memory as emerging? I mean, memory, how have you connected this to wounds and shelter, which are rather quite contrary aspects? I mean, wound we consider as something which is a result of a lack of protection or lack of security, and shelter is something to which we associate the idea of protection and all. So how have you juxtaposed these two contradictory ideas, and what role does memory play in doing this?
Thank you, Shati, and I am grateful to Hawakal for giving us this opportunity of talking about this book. Grateful to Sayantan also for saying a few things about my book, which probably the book does not deserve. I really don't know. Anyway, yes, Shati, two aspects are there about the question that you have put to me. One is about memory. Now, this is how I look at memory, and probably many of us also think so, that after reaching a certain age, we keep on living in memory, right? And at least for me, this is so. For instance, this is also true. I have a poem on this also. I don't know whether I translated that poem for this book or not. That after a certain period of time, you keep on only losing your near and dear ones, right? For instance, and that has happened to me as well. I have lost my father, my grandma, my brother even during COVID. So this is how I look at memory, because it's very difficult to run away from memory, and it seems that you are living continuously in memory, and memory keeps on shaping you. In fact, I think that whatever I write is actually about memory. This is how I look at memory, because another thing also which is very important, Sayantan was talking partly about that, about my relationship with nature. I was born in a village. Now I live in a town which is Bardwan, but I was born in a village and spent my entire childhood in that village. So that is also something which is very important, because if you take away my childhood from me, probably I won't be able to write even a single line, whether it's a poem or, because this is how I look at memory. In fact, I keep on, sometimes it also seems to me that people whom I have lost, they are still with me. I have written a poem on that as well, meaning I keep on living with them. Might be that is, and this is also a part of probably Indian reality as well, meaning if I put it in this way, some people might say that I talk to my brother, I talk to my father, I talk to my grandma. People might say that this is something which is not real, that it's becoming surreal. But if you think of Indian reality, then Indian reality is about this. Indian reality is not exactly the Western reality or the way the West looks at reality. Indian reality is something that always uses a bit of imagination, a bit of memory, a bit of the past, and that's how we confront reality. So in that sense, when I am sitting here, it could be that actually I am not sitting here, right? So in that way, memory, and the other thing which links your question about memory with wound, I have written a lot of poems in which memory is a part of the title as well, and there are a few poems on wound as well. It's very difficult to in fact, once again, I am reminded, because I teach a bit of literature and theory as well, I am reminded of Paul Ricoeur, who has said that there can't be any happy forgetting, right? There can be happy memory, but there can't be any happy forgetting, which is true. Particularly when you are insulted, it becomes very difficult for you to forget that, extremely difficult. And that is something that I have written about also. Perhaps one or two poems are here as well, where I have talked about this, that how difficult it is to forget an insult, right? You could be the happiest person if you can forget the insult, but as I've told you that there can't be any happy forgetting. So, but one thing why the wound becomes the shelter when you get insulted, and that too sometimes publicly, you start ultimately living in the wound, inhabiting with the wound. And at one point of time, the wound, look, in fact, I have a poem on this theme also. Wound is the shelter. And what as everybody was talking, since the morning, that poetry happens, it comes to us, true, absolutely true. So what happened, I just watched one day a squirrel, and that poem came to my mind, because I found that it was going inside a hole in a tree, which is actually the wound of the tree, and then coming out of that wound, and then once again going inside. So I was struck by that this wound of the tree, how it has become a kind of a shelter to so many. But when I have used this metaphor or this image in my poem, I have used in two senses. One, yes, of course, my wound has become a kind of shelter to so many. They have been able to troll me, and they have got a different kind of a shelter there as well. But as I've told you that when I start living with that wound, it becomes a kind of a shelter, particularly if you are creative, because it gives you lines, it gives you poems, and you start living in those poems, and it's a kind of an outlet that saves you as well. There can't be any happy forgetting. But when you write about something which is giving you pain, causing you extreme pain, you get a kind of a relief. And the wound, which is the cause of the genesis of a poem, then becomes the shelter to the poet, to the creative artist. And it has happened to me so many times when I got insulted, when I was hurt. Ultimately, at the end of the day, might be after 3 or 4 days, might be after 6 months, that incident took a shape in the form of a poem, and I got some kind of relief. And then I thought that I'm grateful to that wound, because it has given me a poem, it has given me a shelter as a poet. Perhaps I've been able to make a kind of a sense.
So that is really wonderful of you, sir, to kind of make a metamorphosis of your personal crisis into a wonderful piece of poetry. My next question would be to Professor Dasgupta. A reading of this anthology makes it clear that the poems draw heavily from memory. So my question is also regarding memory. So I want you to comment upon the efficacy of memories as a poetic ingredient. When how far memories make good subject for poetry, and where would you locate Wund is the Shelter in the tradition of memory studies, if you at all want to locate it there?
Yes, of course. I mean, the different registers of time and one's experiences, those are basic ingredients of poetry across the world. So many poets have used those as their starting points. And when you talk about memory, you're actually talking about a plethora of emotions. It could be a sense of loss, as Angshuman also mentioned. It could be a sense of nostalgia. It could be a sense of nostalgia for something imagined. Memories are not necessarily real in that sense always. So memories, like anything else, could be subjective. Memories are what we make of them. And therefore that opens up a very large area to explore within your poetry. And I think Angshuman has done that, as you were mentioning. Memory does figure as a very important theme. And the extra textual elements Angshuman was also talking about, how memory can actually bring in an opportunity as well. Memories of hurt, memories of sadness often inspire poets, great literateurs, to write. And these memories can be exacerbated, they can be exaggerated. It depends on how the poet, how the writer wants to use it. But of course, memory serves as a very useful, how do we call it, a trope, a very important trope for the writer to derive inspiration to create literature out of.
Since we are running really short of time and we have been intimated about it, I would just like to ask both of you to comment upon this book. We know that this is not only a book of poetry, but it is also a book of anthology of translated poetry. So I want you to talk about the translation aspect of these poems.
Yeah, it's difficult to translate your own poems, and one thing I can assure you that I have been, or rather I was trying to remain as faithful as translator could be to the original, meaning because I have written Aaka Dariya becomes, a river of fire, and having, more chapters in it than there were in the original. So that kind of liberty I have not taken, but some kind of liberty I had to take, definitely, because of the constraints of the language, because English is a different language, and you have to be, this is something that probably Shormiladi was also talking about, or Sangyuktadi was talking about, bicultural, you'll have to be. So something like that I had to keep in mind while translating my own poems into English, and I have been doing that also. I have translated my poems earlier also, but the other thing was the choice, meaning I have around 30 books in Bangla, and it's a book of only 80 pages. So which are the poems that I should pick up and translate? That was also a very tough task initially. Regarding the process of translation, as I've told you that I have tried to remain faithful to the originals, and at the same time I must say that I have talked about this in the introduction also. I don't know whether we have read the introduction or not. I have referred to Arun Kalatkar, and I have quoted him pointing out that translating your own work means committing incest, sleeping with your own daughter. This is true because when I was translating, meaning, yes, when I write in Bangla, of course I do revise my poems, as some of my colleagues were also pointing out in the morning. But when it's done, and when it's published, it's out of your control completely. You get a chance of reading them afresh when you translate them. And the point that I wanted to make by referring to Kolatkar is this, that then I can, it's all about craft. It's not about at all about the content of the poem or about my feelings that I wanted to put in a particular poem. But I become aware of, because when you translate a poem, you engage yourself with each and every word of that poem, right? And you start critically examining your own work as well, as a more conscious reader. And then you become aware of the things which you could have avoided. Meaning this word I could have replaced by that word. So that's why it's almost like looking at the body of your own daughter, looking at the private parts that you shouldn't have seen at all, right? And of course. And that creates a kind of an eerie feeling in you as a translator, and I came across that feeling as well. I became very uncomfortable. I was sometimes even ashamed of writing a particular poem using a particular word which I don't have any option right now to replace in the original Bangla. But I took the chance of replacing that word while translating that poem in English. So one last thing that I should point out about self-translation is this, that it has made me a better poet, because I have become aware of loopholes which are there in my poems, right? So it helps you, of course. And this is something that Shankha Babu once also told me, not about translating my own poems. I had a writer's block, and I was very much worried, and I called him up because he was always just one phone call away from us, and he told me that you translate. If you start translating, whatever you want to translate, you translate. Then you start living with the poem. You start, almost having a kind of an intercourse with the poem. And then you start getting some kind of inspiration from, might be a single word which is there in the poem, and poetry can come back to you. And it had happened to me so many times as well. So this is an advice to the young poets as well, because this is an advice that I got from such a legend, that if you face a writer's block, translate. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, so it's something that I had started off with, in fact, talking about translation. I think the first thing to remember is translation is above all a creative process. So however much we think about being faithful to the original, one shouldn't expect a translated poetry to be so faithful that it doesn't become a poem. The first responsibility of the poet is to create a poem, right? And I think that is what I was trying to emphasize right in the beginning. This book of poems is a wonderful book of poetry. Full stop. That's where I should end, I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both the poet and Professor Kaur and Professor Dasgupta for being here and for engaging into such an animate discussion about poetry, about translation, about memories, about revolt, about protest, and about so many important things of life. So now, and thank you all audience for giving a patient hearing after that sumptuous meal and such a wonderful ambience. You sat through the entire discussion. So thank you all very much. And with this, we come to the close of this. But before we close, thank you, Hawakal, for giving us an opportunity to discuss such wonderful issues here.